The theme of this paper is using digital technologies in the form of computer animation to assess and improve the spoken communication skills of English language learners at a British university. One of the reasons for devising such material is that the academic staff at our institution often find that despite international students achieving overall English proficiency to study on an undergraduate degree programme, they are often unable to produce pragmatically appropriate language inside and outside the classroom. For instance, requesting an extension for an assignment or apologising for being late to class. Staff have also found that simply being in a second language environment has little positive impact on developing pragmatic language, as learners tend to interact with their own L1 groups. Computer-mediated communication, therefore, is an opportunity to bring the real-world context to the classroom and help develop these skills in a meaningful, realistic and stress-free environment. Finally, given the trend for young adults to be involved in gaming and 3D worlds outside of the classroom, it is hoped computer-animated learning materials are a highly motivating resource to develop communication skills. A computer-animated production task, or CAPT, was devised as a way to assess and improve the development of pragmatically appropriate language with a specific focus on requests and apologies. The presentation will introduce features of the CAPT and investigate how it compares with a written discourse completion task, traditionally used to elicit non-native speaker speech samples. It will conclude with highlighting the viability of the CAPT as a learning and assessment tool. This study employs a mixed method approach of an oral DCT in the form of the CAPT and traditional written DCTs used for comparison purposes. These instruments are supported by post-activity student questionnaires. 45 undergraduate Chinese learners of English first completed the CAPT and then the written DCT exactly 1 week later, at the same time and location, to avoid the possibility of one task influencing the other. The two instruments consisted of 12 scenarios, 6 requests and 6 apologies on each of the CAPT and the written DCT. The high-status animated interlocutors portrayed were people whom students were likely to encounter in a year-abroad environment: a university lecturer, a librarian, a campus security guard and a landlady. The responses were transcribed and assessed for pragmatic appropriacy by 3 experienced native speaker EFL tutors on a 5-point Likert scale. The higher the score awarded, the more satisfactory the response. Here we can see an example of the instruments themselves side by side, though the learners completed each one separately. The right side represents an example of the written DCT. First, learners were presented with the 12 scenarios on a task sheet. This involved reading a description of each context and problem, as well as information about the interlocutor, such as their gender and age. Learners were then invited to provide a written version of their oral response, after reading the opening line to the conversation provided by the interlocutor. For the CAPT, learners were presented with a PowerPoint presentation of the 12 scenarios. First, they were required to read the context of each scenario on the right. Following a timed interval, the animated interlocutor would come to life and open the conversation with the same lines such as, "Hello, can I help you?" Learners were then required to provide an oral response to this. Again, the learners had a timed interval within which to respond before the next scenario was presented. All of the written responses from the written DCT and oral responses from the CAPT were transcribed and assessed on a 5-point Likert scale. The results from the data indicate that the CAPT was able to stimulate responses which were assessed as being more satisfactory than their written DCT counterparts. The request data was scored with a mean of 53 on the CAPT and 48 on the written DCT. Similar outcomes were found from the apology data. Though these differences between the instrument scores were not found to be statistically significant, the raters clearly viewed the responses on the CAPT as being superior. This suggests that the written DCT was unable to elicit language that matched the students' capabilities, as highlighted by their improved scores on the CAPT. That the raters preferred the responses on the CAPT suggests then that the content met more of their expectations for actual language use, and the CAPT therefore is perhaps a more effective way of collecting authentic non-native speaker data. All 45 students completed a post-activity questionnaire covering 6 areas. Which instrument was more enjoyable to complete? Which was more authentic to real-life situations? Which was easier to complete? Which was more interesting in content? Which was better as a language learning activity? And which was more helpful for developing communication skills? Overall, the students overwhelmingly preferred the CAPT on all aspects. Unsurprisingly, the CAPT was considered to be a more realistic task to complete in terms of assessing oral skills. Results were less decisive regarding the ease of completing the task itself, but given this is one of the advantages of the written DCT design, this was not unexpected. This study has highlighted that, from the learner's perspective, the CAPT would be a motivating tool to improve pragmatic awareness and may be a viable alternative to the written DCT for several reasons. First, many of the benefits offered by the written DCT, such as controlling test conditions and eliciting sufficient data, are also managed with the CAPT. The CAPT is limited to use in laboratory settings, but does go some way to offering learners real-world context and opportunities for interaction. It can also be administered with a number of learners at the same time. As a diagnostic tool, the CAPT then may prompt learners to produce language more representative of their actual abilities, so practitioners have a more accurate picture of learners' competence. As a practice tool, there are many pedagogical possibilities for its use as self-access material or as a complement to text-based activities. For the purposes of this study, the CAPT has been devised in a basic form to highlight the possibilities offered by animation technologies. The intention, however, is to encourage practitioners to experiment with software like this to improve learner pragmatic competency in a highly motivating, stress-free environment. Thank you for logging on and taking part in this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at the following address. I very much welcome your comments and experiences.